By 1985, India had started having balance of payments problems. By the end of 1990, it was in a serious economic crisis. The government was close to default. Its central bank had refused new credit and foreign exchange reserves had been reduced to such a point that India could barely finance 3 weeks' worth of imports, which led the Indian government to airlift national gold reserves as a pledge to the International Monetary Fund in exchange for a loan to cover balance of payment debts. Causes and consequences. The crisis was caused by currency overvaluation, the current account deficit, and investor confidence played significant role in the sharp exchange rate depreciation. The economic crisis was primarily due to the large and growing fiscal imbalances over the 1980s. During the mid-80s, India started having balance of payments problems. Precipitated by the Gulf War, India's oil import bill swelled, exports slumped, credit dried up, and investors took the money out. Large fiscal deficits, over time, had a spillover effect on the trade deficit, culminating in an external payments crisis. By the end of 1990, India was in serious economic trouble. The gross fiscal deficit of the government rose from 9.0% of GDP in 1980-81 to 10.4% in 1985-86 and to 12.7% in 1990-91. 4. The center alone. The gross fiscal deficit rose from 6.1% of GDP in 1980-81 to 8.3% in 1985-86 and to 8.4% in 1990-91. Since these deficits had to be met by borrowings, the internal debt of the government accumulated rapidly, rising from 35% of GDP at the end of 1980-81 to 53% of GDP at the end of 1990-91. The foreign exchange reserves had dried up to the point that India could barely finance 3 weeks' worth of imports. In mid-1991, India's exchange rate was subjected to a severe adjustment. This event began with a slide in the value of the Indian rupee leading up to mid-1991. The authorities at the Reserve Bank of India took partial action, defending the currency by expending international reserves and slowing the decline in value. However, in mid-1991, with foreign reserves nearly depleted, the Indian government permitted a sharp depreciation that took place in 2 steps within 3 days against major currencies. Recovery. With India's foreign exchange reserves at $1.2 billion in January 1991 and depleted by half by June, barely enough to last for roughly 3 weeks of essential imports. India was only weeks away from defaulting on its external balance of payment obligations. Government of India's immediate response was to secure an emergency loan of $2.2 billion from the International Monetary Fund by pledging 67 tons of India's gold reserves as collateral. The Reserve Bank of India had to airlift 47 tons of gold to the Bank of England and 20 tons of gold to the Union Bank of Switzerland to raise $600 million. National sentiments were outraged and there was public outcry when it was learned that the government had pledged the country's entire gold reserves against the loan. Interestingly, it was later revealed that the van transporting the gold to the airport broke down en route and panic followed. A chartered plane ferried the precious cargo to London between the 21st of May and the 31st of May 1991, jolting the country out of an economic slumber. The Chandrasekhar government had collapsed a few months after having authorized the airlift. The move helped tide over the balance of payment crisis and kick-started P.V. Narasimha Rao's economic reform process. P.V. Narasimha Rao took over as Prime Minister in June, and roped in Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister. The Narasimha Rao government ushered in several reforms that are collectively termed as liberalization in the Indian media. Although most of these reforms came because IMF required those reforms as a condition for loaning money to India in order to overcome the crisis, there were significant opposition to such reforms, suggesting they are an interference with India's autonomy. Then Prime Minister Rao's speech a week after he took office highlighted the necessity for reforms. As New York Times reported, Mr. Rao, who was sworn in as Prime Minister last week, has already sent a signal to the nation, as well as the IMF, that India faced no soft options, and must open the door to foreign investment, reduce red tape that often cripples initiative, and streamline industrial policy. Mr. Rao made his comments in a speech to the nation Saturday night. The foreign reserves started picking up with the onset of the liberalization policies and peaked to $353.876 billion in the week to May 2015. Aftermath. A program of economic policy reform 1991 has since been put in place, which has yielded very satisfactory results so far. While much still remains on the unfinished reform agenda, the prospects of macro stability and growth are indeed encouraging.